This is Rudkowski of WeAreChange.org, and I'm joined by the one and only Paul Hellyer, former Minister of Defense from Canada, a great statesman, someone that I admired for quite a bit. And I have to say, one thing Paul was telling me about recently, just when we were eating lunch before, he was telling me about how he was growing up in the Depression and how the whole financial system in Canada was taken over by banksters. So, Paul, can you tell us about some of your experiences growing up in Canada? You're 91 years old. You lived through a lot. You saw a lot. Can you tell us what are some of the most important things people should know about the history of the banking system in Canada?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. It's sort of the passion of my life. My late wife would have called it obsession. But I grew up during the Depression, as you stated, and saw poverty at its rawest form, people coming by looking for food. We lived in a farm, and people would come by and walk in, and mother would give them something to eat to keep them going. And so this really burned a place in my mind which was still there. You know, I still just can't get it out of my mind. And so after I went to school for a while in California, and then a couple of years in the armed forces, and went to university. I studied economics, and I asked my professors if recessions and depressions were necessary, and they couldn't give me an honest answer. And that was the reason that I went into politics in the first place, because I had come to the conclusion in university that they were not necessary, that they were just part of the system. And you can ask the first 20 economists you see, and 19 of them at least will say, well, it's a cyclical system, and that's the way it works, and you should try and beat the cycles if you can anticipate them. So I saw from the Depression on through until now a complete, well, more than one cycle of experiments in monetary policy. And I know what will work and what won't work. And in 1938, which was before the war, of course, there were no jobs in Canada. And then along came the war, and all of a sudden, people were either in the armed forces or working in industry, building munitions, building factories, doing all of these things. And then we brought unemployment down from a very high figure to a historical low of 1%. Never been achieved since, and frankly, I wouldn't want to bring it down that low now because it would be inflationary, but if we could get half of what we have now, that would be a really good thing, which we can do. And so you might say, well, where did the government, because it had no money, get the money to pay the people in the armed forces and to pay for the munitions and to build the factories? And the answer is the Bank of Canada, which was a publicly owned bank owned by the people of Canada, printed it, P-R-I-N-T-E-D. And the way the system worked was that the government would give the Bank of Canada a piece of paper, which we call a bond, and the Bank of Canada would run the printing presses, give the government the cash, deposit it to their accounts in the banks, and the government spent it to pay those of us who were in the armed forces and to buy the munitions and buy our equipment and all that sort of thing. And then Canada, for the size of our country, put on an amazing show during World War II and played a very significant part. At one point, I think we had the third or fourth largest navy in the world, and we're just a tiny country as far as the population is concerned. So we really did our share and more. And we had the Commonwealth Air Training Plan there. We had pilots from Australia, New Zealand, and England, and we had some from Norway as well. So we were in there and did our share. And so after the war, we had this same system. I didn't explain that what happened, the government would pay the interest on the bonds to the Bank of Canada, and then they would give the interest back to the government as dividends, because we owned the bank, and they paid dividends, and all they deducted was the cost of administration, carrying the things from one side of the street to the other. So this system worked perfectly, and after the war, we kept it on and used it for the post-war infrastructure, the St. Lawrence Seaway, a fantastic project, and the Trans-Canada Highway, first time ever that we had a ribbon of asphalt to run from one side of the country to the other. And then the big new airport terminals, and even more important, I think, as the foundation of our Social Security system, which was considered one of the best in the world. And so everything was really moving along very nicely until 1974. 1974 was a year of big change in the world, and it's never been the same since. So our governor of the bank, unilaterally, and without even discussing it with the Prime Minister or Parliament, changed the system, and instead of working for the citizens, the shareholders, and providing us with cheap money, zero cost money, which we had, quite a lot of for so many years, they started taking their orders from the Bank for International Settlements in Zurich, Switzerland, which is really the apex of what, in my latest book, I call the money mafia. It is really sort of the nerve center for the handful of people who really run the banking system, and they, along with others, run the world, but they're the top of the heap. And so then the central banks in the United States and Canada brought on two terrible recessions. Paul Volcker was trying out a new system. He bought into monetarism, which was the brainchild of Chicago School. The name doesn't come to my.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's funny.
Anyway, well, I should know it because I've taken it in vain so often. Anyway, he in effect decided that the bank should be deregulated, unregulated, and so we had this terrible recession because Volcker was a disciple, and he put interest rates in the United States up to 18%. In Canada, they went to 22%, and then that brought on the terrible recession. Millions of people lost their jobs, their houses, their businesses, and governments went into deficit, had to borrow in the market. And so instead of getting zero cost money, we had to start paying 22% for it to pay the interest on the money that we borrowed as a result of the deficit. And they brought on another recession a decade later, 1991, and gave it to us again, just as we were beginning to recover a little bit. And so the cost of this to the ordinary people is astronomical. And Ellen Brown, who is one of the best people in the United States on money, she's written a book called The Web of Debt, which everybody should read the first 100 pages of if they're interested in this subject. She said that it had cost us more than $1 trillion. And shame on me, I didn't believe her. But as a privy councillor, former cabinet minister, I have access to the parliamentary parliamentary library research system, and they did the mathematics for me and came back in and said, yes, from 1974-75 fiscal year to 2010-11, $1 billion. And in the United States, a comparable thing would be multiplying by about 13. So it's about the size of your total federal debt. And this was all as a result of, in effect, turning the money system completely. It had been largely run by the money mafia for a long time, but here it was completely turned over to them.
To private hands, to private banksters. And can you describe how the Banks of International Settlements is involved in all of this?
Well, the Bank for International Settlements, which actually was close to the Nazi Party during the 30s, and then played both ends against the middle during the war, is where settlements between countries' currencies happen. And it's just sort of a exchange for one currency for another, but it has tremendous power. And more lately, under the Group of 20 after it was set up, they allowed the Bank for International Settlements to set the international rules which govern the system. And so let me talk about that now, because they have set the leverage, which I describe in the book. If I could go back to, say, the time when the Bank of England was incorporated, which is a little over 300 years ago, King William of Orange was fighting a war against the French and ran out of money and needed something to replenish his arms and build up his navy and so on, so had no credit. So somebody suggested, how about a bank? So he got some very rich bankers to put up £1,200,000 in gold and silver, and that was the capital of the Bank of England. And they lent it all to the king at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government guaranteed loan. And then the king said, now you may print, P-R-I-N-T, £1,200,000 and lend it to your rich friends at a high interest rate. So in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money to the king and to the friends and collect interest from both. So you get two batches of interest on one batch of capital. Well, over the years, that ratio, as we call it, or leverage is the sort of the official word that they use, has increased from 2 to 1, which it was then, 2 times interest, to a much higher figure. First of all, in the early years of the 20th century in the United States, your federally incorporated banks had to have 25% gold reserve, which meant they were able to lend their money 4 times. In Canada, when I was young, we had to have a cash reserve of 8%. And that means that the banks were able to lend the same money 12.5 times. After, Friedman was the name I was looking for, after Friedmanism or monetarism or whatever you want to call it came into effect, and the rules changed, the banks were allowed to lend 20 times. So they could lend the same money 20 times. Now this is where I got the inspiration for the money mafia. We're having an investigation in our city of Montreal in Canada about the alleged rip-off of the mafia, and the Sicilian mafia have allegedly been taking 2.5% off the top of all the contracts in that big city for a long time. The banks take 95% off the top, which is the reason I call it the money mafia. And what it means is they can invest $5 million in what I call blood, sweat, and tears money. And then they can create credit to lend $20 million to other people and charge them high interest rates on it. And that's just virtual money. It's not real money. But the people that they lend it to have to pay back $20 million in blood, sweat, and tears money, plus interest. Yep. So you look at it from the standpoint of a student, for example, that needs to borrow $50,000 to finish their schooling, and the bank, bless them, and I use that in sort of a backhanded way, will often, if it's guaranteed especially, lend them up to $50,000 to finish their studies. But the bank only has to have $2,500 in blood, sweat, and tears money. When the student graduates, they have to pay back $50,000 in blood, sweat, and tears money. I mean, work at it for years to pay it off, plus interest. And that's the reason the system is really rotten to the core, and it's been that way for a long time.
Can you name some of the names or institutions or banks that were a part of this takeover in 1974?
In 1974, it was just, we transferred really responsibility for policy to the Bank for International Settlement. And this was, I think, generally adopted by pretty well most of the central banks of the world at that time. And it's still that way. Yeah. And quibbling about it in Congress, whether they should tighten, have the same rules or not, and so on. But the banks so far have outsmarted the politicians by using them to do their bidding, and it's got to change. The system, let me state bluntly, there will be no peace on earth and justice until the whole system is revised. And so in my book, The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis, I say that governments have got to start creating some of the money, like we did in Canada from 1939 to 1974. That is the solution. Not exactly the same system. I've put a better one in just a better mechanic, a way of doing it. But that they've got to get into the business of creating debt-free money that they can spend into circulation and not have to pay back with interest. Then they can balance budgets at the federal level, state level, municipal level. They can give people, the working people, a better deal on taxes. They can do a lot of things, including going the opposite way to what's been going on for the last 20 years, of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, by paying the working people more without having to raise the taxes of the rich people who are very averse to taxes. And they can do a lot of things. And if they instituted this system, which I'm recommending, 34% of all new money should be created by the government itself, and they introduced that system over 7 years, they would be able to reduce the federal debt, if they want, by something like 30 or 35%. So you could knock maybe $5 trillion off the federal debt in the U.S., or you could spend a trillion or so for helping some of the poor countries of the world that have been ripped off by the present system.
So just to clarify, you're calling for a system just like JFK or Abraham Lincoln implemented, where the government printed their own money, like Lincoln printed the greenbacks. Is that something that you're calling for as a solution to the Ponzi scheme that is the banking system today?
I'm not recommending 100% government-created money because I don't trust politicians to that extent, for one thing, having served with them for so long. And it would cause too much disruption in the system because the system has been established for so long. And you know, pension funds and so on have a lot of government bonds, and what you're really talking about if you did that would be to pay them all off over a period of time, and it would be just too disruptive. You'd probably bring on a terrible recession or depression. Not necessary. I'm recommending 7 years to do about 5% a year, or 5% for 6 years and 4% the last year, or whatever, you know, to make it come out at 34% after 7 years. And this would be more than enough to balance all the budgets and to start paying down the debt a little bit each year during that period of time. At the end of that 7 years, and here's the great thing, the bank ratio would be down from 20 to 1 to 2 to 1, the way it was when the Bank of England was first brought into existence. And the money mafia would lose its power to run the world, which is the number one objective. Well, that's not the number one objective is to have food in the mouths of people that have no jobs and roofs over their head. That's the number one objective. But it would be that plus an equally important or almost equally important thing, and that's getting rid of the people who have caused the Great Depression and the Great Recession. Get rid of the cause, so that it doesn't happen again. And so you do not have cycles. So you have a smoothly running machine that will can be counted on to provide for the full, in effect, full growth, not either to inflation or deflation, but smooth sailing for as far ahead as you can see. So it's just and of course it relates to so many other things too. What the present situation is, we have this question of global warming, which is probably the most important problem in the world. And at the moment, governments won't do anything about it because they don't have the financial flexibility to pay for it, to subsidize it. Yeah. Or so they say.
Well, the government's looking for answers where they could tax people and control people because of the climate crisis that they claim, and implement more taxes and figure out a way that the corporations and the military-industrial complex could still keep destroying the environment, which it is. But not moving away into that particular topic. When you were Minister of Defense of Canada, were you aware of these facts? How was your experience being Minister of the Defense? Was there any kind of insight that you could give us with the banking system that you have from the inside?
Well, yeah, actually, what happened was when I was first elected in 1949, one of the reasons I ran, I graduated from university in May and was elected in June, was because the economists, the experts, said there was going to be a depression in 1950, another one, like the one I hated, had gone through. And so I said, it's not necessary, doesn't need to happen, know the solutions, got to get elected. So I did the impossible and got elected at the age of 25. Well, then, of course, you learn the second lesson of politics. Just because you get elected to the assembly or parliament in our country doesn't mean you have any authority or real, say. But what happened was that the people running the world started another war in Korea. And so they started getting governments to print money to pay for the Korean War. And they printed enough to keep the system going for 15 or 20 years after that. And so you had what we call the golden years, when actually things were pretty good. And the division of income between government and business and labor was pretty good. And everybody was fairly happy. And things were going along pretty well, when all of a sudden the rich people of the world said, hey, these trade unionists, people making cars and so on, they're making too much money. So we've got to do something about that, and we've got to change the system and put in globalization and make it possible for us to get more of the chips and to put them down where they belong, where they used to be before World War II. So that's what's happened, and it's been getting worse. The latest figures that came out, I saw a few days ago, that the movement of both capital ownership of assets and incomes has been getting worse, both between poor people and rich people within countries and between poor countries and rich countries. So this has been the result of the little tricks that the mafia and the cabal, as I call them, because it's a bigger thing that involves both the money mafia and the oil cartel and the transnational corporations and some of the intelligence agencies and a big slice of the U.S. military. They're all in it together now, but with the money people at the top.
Very well said. Thank you so much for speaking out. Can you tell us the title of your book again, and where could people find it, and more information about you as well?
It's called The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis. It's my 14th book. I thought the 13th, which is called Light at the End of the Tunnel and is still available, was going to be it was a light at the end of the tunnel, a survival plan for the human species. And I thought I'd said everything that I knew and wanted to say by then. That was about 4 years ago. But so many terrible things have been happening since, and so much more information has been sent my way by people who say, here, maybe Hellyer will get some of this out into the public domain, that I decided to write this one, The Money Mafia. And as far as I know, it's available from your local bookstore, and certainly Amazon has it, and you can get it from my website if you want to have it autographed and pay a little extra for it. It's paulhellyerweb.com, but it's widely available.
Thank you so much for your expertise and your wisdom and all the information that you've been able to get for us.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.